Hi, it's Bighara here with another installment of my video blog. Today I was going to talk a little bit about minis, which is a subject which I enjoy a lot, and some of the pros and cons when it comes to using them in certain classic and old school kind of games, like Basic and Expert Dungeons and Dragons, Labyrinth Lord, old school D&D, things like that. Some of the pros and cons. First of all, the pros. First of all, they look cool. A bunch of painted minis on the table can really add a lot to the visual aspect of the game, give people a chance to really just enjoy literally the eye candy of it. It can help sometimes with player interest and getting them more involved with what's going on, because it adds that, like I say, to that sort of visualization aspect of the game, which, when you're using your imagination, it's great to have everything sort of, pictured in your head, but to have a visual aid, whether it's a drawing or a map the DM's made, or minis or something like that, that can be a big help too. Some of the cons, well, time and money are probably the biggest ones. It really is its own hobby, painting and doing things like that, because the work involved and the time and like I say, the money too. Not only if you want to get really good, but even if you're just trying to get stuff painted to get on the table. And like I say about getting really good at it, if you go out and look at some of the award-winning stuff out on the web, you can see some stuff taken to really, really amazing levels of detail and extremes, both in terms of how well they were painted and just things like just the sheer number of minis and maybe somebody's Warhammer 40K army or something like that, which represents a pretty huge investment in money. Another drawback to it could be if the players start focusing too much on the models and not what's actually going on in the game. The models and the minis and things should be an aid towards understanding the game, not like a piece on a board game where it is actually an integral part, at least to my thinking. If you get to that level, you've probably gone further than you should. I know I run into situations sometimes where players will look at a mini that I've put out because, let's say they're fighting an ogre, and I put an ogre mini out there and say, there's the ogre. And they say, oh, okay, well, you said the ogre had an axe, and that mini has a club. And it's like, that just makes me nuts. That's a pet peeve of mine with some players. And I understand why they do it, because they're trying to gather information, and that's fair. But they need to be aware that I can't have a mini for every possible combination, and if I described it verbally as an ogre with an axe, then don't worry about the club on the mini. Another area that you can run into issues when you're using minis and scenery and terrain and things like that is with mapping. In classic games like classic D&D and retro clones and that sort of thing, the players mapping out the dungeon is very much part of the experience, in my thinking, and that includes, it's worked into some of the rules involving things like how fast they're moving through the dungeon and so forth and so on. And if you're using something like battle mat, which I'll talk about in a minute, or if you're using scenery and terrain, sometimes players will think, well, are you just going to lay out the whole dungeon and that's our map? And well, in my case, no, I'm not. And I try to explain to them that what I'll do is, if there is an important encounter, I will draw it out on the mat, or I will lay out the scenery if I have it, and then that way when you put your minis down to figure out where everything is, like in a case of fighting an ogre in his cave or what have you, you'll have the visualization there, so you know that there's a wall over here, there's a door over there, whatever it is, and then you can go from there. But that's not going to be a map of the entire dungeon. At least that's not how I'm going to do it. Maybe other DMs will do it a different way. In game, another thing is games like classic D&D or Labyrinth Lord or a lot of the retro clones and stuff like that, most of them don't actually require what I refer to as a tactical layout, where you have a grid or measured out with squares or hexes or what have you, inherent in the rules. In games like 3rd edition D&D, and I assume in 4th edition and some other games as well, there's a lot of very specific rules about things like, are you in an adjacent square to this other to this foe or what have you. Ranges, attacks of opportunity is a good example. Things like that, where it actually is going to really matter, or where you're going to use things like a blast template to figure out how big of an area a spell or a weapon or something is going to affect. You know, fireball goes off. Are you in a square that's affected or not? Things like that. But in classic D&D and in the retro clones and stuff, those even though it gives things like ranges and distances and so forth like that, they're not actually tied to having you know, exact measurements and a map or a tactical grid or things like that laid out on the table. And that's something I think that came mostly later, at least in the case of Dungeons and Dragons. So when you're using it, I like to try and use it sparingly, and that's mostly why. Okay, a couple things I was going to say also was about some of the products that I've run into over the years and that I recommend or can say a little bit about. First off, I mentioned earlier the Chessex Battle Mat, which is from Chessex company, which I'll include a link in the notes. They do make dice. They also make the wet erase battle mats, and these things are great. I own a few of them. They come in different scales. They have hex and square, different size mats, 1 inch and 1.5 inches, I think. So you get a hold of one of these. I actually bought a couple where I bought their factory seconds, where they may have like a tiny little mark on them or something, but they decided they couldn't sell them as you know, whatever, top grade or what have you. But honestly, it makes no difference, and I got them for a really good deal. You get some wet erase markers, and you can lay out a nice little scene really quick. So a wet paper towel, you wipe it all off, it's ready to go again. These things are really cool if you're going to be using this sort of stuff and you're trying to find things for this sort of thing in your game. As far as the minis themselves, I'm going to rattle off a quick list, but I'll talk a little bit about a couple of them. For two-dimensional, there are two companies I would recommend. One is Fiery Dragon, which does the Counter Collection. They do a lot of 3rd and 4th edition stuff, but you can get a lot of classic monsters and things. And these are just, I think they're now, you can actually get them as PDF downloads, but they're like 1-inch squares that you can cut out that have like a color picture of an orc or a kobold or what have you, or larger ones for larger monsters like dragons and the like. Cardboard Heroes from Steve Jackson Games, and these can actually be put on little stands and move around, but again, they're printed out. They're not three-dimensional. And then for actual minis that you might, if you don't want to bother painting them, Reaper Miniatures has a few pre-painted plastics, and of course Wizards of the Coast, their D&D miniatures game with their pre-painted minis. I usually recommend going to some eBay stores and that sort of thing, and so you know what you're getting instead of going through the whole booster pack nonsense. But sometimes you can get a deal where you can get, you know, a handful of something fairly common like bandits or orcs or that sort of thing, when you don't pay a whole lot, a couple dollars per mini, which is cheaper than, you know, buying the kinds you paint. For painting, personally, I own about 1,000 miniatures. Some of them are the pre-painted plastics, but a lot of them are ones I've painted and more still to paint. Most of mine are Reaper miniatures, at least the stuff I use for RPGing, and those are probably your classic go-to company for things like player character minis and stuff like that. Mega Miniatures, which they have a store on eBay, and they do a lot of really great old school style minis, slightly smaller but still compatible in scale. I'm not going to get into the whole 25 versus 28 millimeter, etc. Subject. There's also, of course, Games Workshop, which does the Warhammer Fantasy and the Warhammer 40K and the Lord of the Rings minis. They can be a little pricey, and mostly they're plastic, but sometimes you can get a good deal on them. And if you want just a whole bunch of, you know, Urukai or Moria goblins or dwarves or stuff like that, you can get a deal on those, especially if you cruise eBay and stuff like that. And then you can, these are great rank and file minis. Otherworld Miniatures from the UK is doing a lot of stuff with some of the classic D&D creatures. They did that Player's Handbook cover, Idle, and they also have done some giants and stuff, which are really cool. The only drawback with that in the US is the shipping from the UK can be a bit much, but if you like that old school, like first edition classic D&D look to some of the monsters, definitely check out Otherworld Miniatures from the UK. Scenery, which I haven't talked about a whole lot. You can build it yourself. There are books on scratch built scenery. If you're interested in companies that can either sell pre-made scenery or supplies for making gaming scenery, I'll mention a couple real quick. For pre-made, the big name in that is Dwarven Forge. They're not cheap, but they're pretty cool looking, and they do things like dungeon corridors and stuff like that. WorldWorks Games, this is one I really like. This is one, they do printable cardstock folding scenery that you cut and glue yourself, but you can print it out over and over and over again, and they do all sorts of things. They do sci-fi, they do modern era, they do fantasy, pirate theme and all this stuff. There are other companies out there that have kind of, I don't know. To me, I look at it and it looks like they've ripped them off. I'm not going to get into that debate. WorldWorks was the original. WorldWorks does, to my eye, and I've built a lot of it over the years, the highest quality stuff. And like I say, it seems to me, all I can say on the subject is, I see WorldWorks come out with a product, and then a couple weeks later, some other companies come up with something that looks an awful lot like it. But they never beat WorldWorks to the market with it. So it always makes me feel like maybe they're getting ripped off, so I always try to give my business to WorldWorks. The last company I'm going to mention is Hearst Arts. These people make the castle molds. They're silicone rubber molds. They're about that big. And you make these bricks, and they're kind of like Legos, but you cast them out of plaster, and then you glue them together and paint them, and you can make tons of cool stuff. Definitely a bigger investment in time and money. Like I said earlier, this is really its own hobby, but you can come up with some really cool pieces if you want to go that way. I'm not going to get into a lot of subjects about how-tos on painting stuff. First of all, I'm no expert, and second of all, that would be a whole other series of videos and really getting a little bit further afield than the subjects I usually cover. But anyway, that's what I got for now. Talk to you later.